Karen Levy, professor at Cornell University, author of Data Driven: Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance. Karen, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. So, we hear a lot about a trucker shortage in this country. I find the phrasing a bit curious, given the fact that these are human beings, and you write about this too, how they're basically treated as infrastructure despite being people. But we don't hear much about the reasons behind said shortage. I guess let's start there, and then we can dive into some of the history that got us to this point and the very, very terrifying point in terms of surveillance and treatment that we're at right now.
Yeah, I mean, a trucker will be very quick to inform you that there is not a trucker shortage in the United States, but there is a wage shortage. There are plenty of folks who are equipped to do the work, who have their commercial driver's licenses, who would like to do the work, but the way we compensate truckers in this country and the degree of kind of infrastructure we afford them to do their work, like that's insufficient. So the churn rate in trucking is really high. In some segments of the industry, it's like 100% a year. Like every trucker leaves their job every year on average, for some kinds of firms. And so it's just the kind of job that like chews you up and spits you out in many ways. Like truckers make about 47K per year. In 1980, they made about 110K in today's dollars. So like their wages have just tanked, and they're like away from home all the time and like can't make doctor's appointments, and like their work is really difficult and unsafe, and it's been equated sometimes to sweatshop labor in terms of the amount of hours they work and the wages that they make and the risk that they put themselves at. And so all of those things like are not recipes for a lot of people wanting to stay in those jobs for a long period of time.
And the reason that the wages have fallen to that degree, I mean, you can trace them back to very concrete decisions in our history, to unions being undercut basically since the 1970s, and you write about that. Do you mind telling that story a bit, Karen?
Yeah, sure. So trucking in the United States has been formally deregulated since 1980. It was like one of the industries, one among a few, but like one of the big industries, for which there was this big deregulatory push in 1980. And so what that meant is that, up until that point, the federal government played a much more active role in setting rates in the industry and creating barriers to entry for new companies. So like you had to go through a whole process if you wanted to be a trucking company. And in 1980, they were like, we're not doing that anymore. This is just a pure market. And so what that meant was like several things, right? A bunch of companies went out of business. Rates plummeted. So there was like kind of a race to the bottom in terms of cost. And the other thing that sort of got competed away was truckers' wages, right? So that's when we started to see this like crazy marked decline in how much money truckers were making. And it's been pretty stagnant. Like that's been kind of just what trucking has looked like for about the last 40 years. Like wages, you would think, right? Like oftentimes we would sort of intuitively assume that wages would go up if there's such a shortage, but that actually hasn't really happened in trucking. The solution has been to like come up with kind of fresh meat. So, to the extent that there has been a policy like that, we tried to address these problems via policy. The way we've done that is like by trying to subsidize new driver training and like get more people into the industry, but not necessarily to deal with some of the things in the industry that make it such an unlivable job.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of those tweaks in a bit, but I just wanted to underscore the precipitous decline in union membership among truckers and how you can just see that in dollar figures. And people associate trucking with unions, I think, from old tropes about it and old realities, but union membership is way, way down since the period that you described.
Yeah, it's in like the best numbers I can find are like low to mid single digits. Like, and I've had a lot of conversations with truckers, and I have yet to find a trucker who was like gung ho about unions. A lot of folks, even if you ask them about unionization, truckers are like very autonomous people. Like a lot of them got into the industry because they didn't want somebody looking over their shoulder, which we'll see becomes ironic. Because now a lot of people are looking over their shoulder, right? They didn't really they're not crazy about kind of the structures of organizations or of government. They just want to do their work in their own way. And so unionization, you're right, like it used to be, like the Teamsters were essentially a trucking union, in the heyday of, like the 70s. But today there is just very negligible in long haul, in like the long haul segment. There's pretty negligible union membership. In delivery driving, it's a bit higher, right? Like your FedEx and UPS drivers, there you see a bit more, or in port trucking, like some of the more specialized industries. But the folks who are going over the road for like hundreds of miles at a time, it has like a very, very small role.
The hundreds of miles at a time that you described there. I mean, one, this is essential to the functioning of the economy as we have it, constructed. And we just saw essentially Biden participate in union busting, or at least he's strike. I shouldn't say union busting. That's the wrong word. But he broke the strike for the rail workers, and that was because it's so essential to the economy, right? And that the workers in the rail industry got the short end of the stick there because they were unable to get what they bargained for. And it's kind of a similar dynamic with truckers in that they are essential, and yet there has not been any progress in the past few decades in giving them what they need to live lives that are healthy, to get paid and compensated for what they provide for the economy. And it's gone really the opposite way.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I mean, we like to talk a big game, especially maybe post-pandemic, about essential workers and how valuable they are and how much we appreciate them. But as you point out, right, truckers are like about as essential as it gets, like in all circumstances, right? Like truckers have this saying, if you got it, a truck brought it. Like basically everything you have, like everything you're wearing, everything in the room you're in right now, like there's a very, very strong chance that everything in that room was on a truck at some point, right? Like they just touch everything. And, that people sometimes talk about like the digital age and how it changes work. But like, if anything, trucking is more essential in the digital age because we now all expect our like Amazon Prime deliveries very quickly. We want to know where everything is. We've come to expect things, like when we want them, like on demand. And, somebody pays the price for that. And as you point out, not only I think have we not kind of met the call in terms of the wages we give these folks, but we also fail to provide a lot of the infrastructure that they need to do their work safely. So, truckers need places to like pull over and sleep at night or go to the bathroom or like just do essential human things. And what you see, arising is like towns saying, kind of NIMBYism, right? Towns saying like, well, we don't want a truck stop because we think there's going to be crime there, or, trucks can't drive on our roads, or truckers can't use the bathroom, stuff like that. And that's been going on, as you point out, for a long time. And I think we are only now like starting to see some folks in Washington start to recognize that like that is not a way to treat an industry that we desperately need.
And so with Washington getting involved, that kind of brings us to the surveillance that you talk so much about in your book. Instead of regulating the industry to pay their workers and to give them lodging, bathrooms, like you describe, there has been a different approach that's been taken, and it's quite troubling. And also, it's this is cross industry, essentially, this kind of worker digital surveillance that we're seeing, but it's more pronounced because of the conditions of this industry that we laid out previously. Talk a bit about the rise in the surveillance technology in the trucking industry.
Yeah, so one of the biggest, kind of most pervasive and longstanding problems in the industry is fatigue, right? So truckers are by and large paid by the mile that they drive. They get like a certain number of cents per mile. And so they're only paid for the time that they're actually moving, right? So they're very much incentivized to stay on the road as much as they possibly can. They don't get paid to sleep. They don't get paid while they're waiting to be loaded or unloaded, or while they're doing an inspection, or any of the other things that like are definitely part of the job, but they're just not compensated. So they're incentivized to do all this work. And because of that, because that's the compensation structure in the industry, and because, as you point out, right, like these are folks who are severely undercompensated for their labor, there's a drive, there's an incentive to drive as much as you can, because that's what you have to do to kind of keep the lights on at home, right, or to feed your kids. in response to that problem, right, there are federal rules that limit how much truckers can drive. And instead of kind of addressing these root causes of overwork and the fact that a lot of people were kind of violating those rules pretty regularly, the federal government has, since 2017, required truck drivers to be electronically monitored to kind of, and the goal is, right, to make sure that they're complying with these timekeeping rules. Before that, they used paper and pencil logbooks, and kind of nobody took those requirements very seriously because they had to put food on the table. So the goal now, so the approach then has sort of been like almost like policing, right? To kind of institute this surveillance, to know, where truckers are and what they're doing, or excuse me, how long they've been driving. So this is accomplished via what's called an electronic logging device, or ELD, which all truckers have to use. What's interesting about the ELD, well, there's a couple things. I mean, there's a whole book's worth of things about the ELD that I wrote. But, one of the interesting things about it is, first, as you point out, the approach is not, let's actually solve these underlying root problems, which are economic. Let's instead kind of, use tech as like a Band-Aid on this problem, right? So we won't actually address the fact that like nothing, we haven't changed anything about how drivers are paid or like the fact that they have nowhere safe to pull over. Instead, we'll just kind of crack down on them via this digital monitoring. And then the other thing that's happened in trucking, and this ties in, I think, to your point, Emma, about kind of all kinds of workplaces being under more surveillance, is that the electronic logging device has kind of provided this backbone for truckers, the companies that truckers work for, their employers, to also then monitor them in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Like they already had to buy this device that's hardwired into the truck. So now that they had to buy that, like it's not that much of an extra cost to like monitor things like how much fuel the trucker is using, or how hard he's braking, or whether he's gone out of route, or all kinds of things, even up to and including some pretty intimate like biometric monitoring. Cameras trained on the driver's face. Some of those have like use AI to detect if a driver's eyelids are fluttering or if his head is nodding because he's too tired. All kinds of stuff, right, is kind of entering the scene. And it's all like ornaments on a Christmas tree or something. Like the government was like, you have to buy a Christmas tree. And then, the trucking companies and third parties that are also interested in this data kind of hang the ornaments of additional surveillance on the Christmas tree, right? So now truckers are kind of under a bunch of different eyes all at once.
I mean, what I would do if I were in that situation, if I was a trucker, would be I'd try to get it like an Adderall prescription. I mean, seriously, right? And
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you talk about how the usage of stimulants, it was a real issue. And I mean, this is kind of a second order, but it is important that to know that this has been a problem in the industry because that's the only way that truckers can stay awake and do their jobs to that extent.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, right? And this is a long-standing problem, right? Like truckers have been kind of under the gun to do their work under all kinds of conditions that are inhospitable or that kind of stretch the limits of what their bodies can do. And they've used all kinds of different solutions to address that, including, sometimes illegal stimulants or legal stimulants, stuff like 5-hour energy, things like that are really common. And I think like what that demonstrates, because this is so longstanding, is that again, like these are not technology problems, right? Like these are economic problems. We've decided that the way to deal with this is to stretch people past their limits and or to kind of, surveil them so that we can make some inference about how tired they are, rather than just like paying them for the actual hours that they work, for example, so that they're not forced to kind of exploit their own labor.
I mean, that is it's deeply troubling, and it is indicative of a larger philosophy of technology solving all that I think has it's a problem across multiple sectors. We encounter it, I think, when we talk about the ways that algorithms can filter out, hateful content when it comes to social media companies and stuff. And there's this uh, almost like godlike quality that people ascribe to technology, like it's going to fix everything, when really
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this is just it. One, this creates more pressure on drivers when they don't need it, and two, this can be solved by simple solutions where we don't have to have all of this digital monitoring. You just increase wages, don't make it tethered to their time on the road, and put in place the protections that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think we often use technology as like duct tape or something, right? We're like, well, we could solve this problem, but doing so like upsets the balance of power in some way, right? Like requires that, that power be redistributed, or that, wages be fairly significantly, increased for particular laborers. And because of that, it's appealing for policymakers to say like, oh, what about this like shiny thing? Like, won't this solve the problem? One of the things that's interesting in trucking is that, if the problem the logging device is supposed to be solving is like safety, right, or is fatigue, it isn't even doing that, right? So even on its own terms, it's kind of failing. The studies that we have show that since this technology became mandatory, truckers feel that the rules that they're under are so much more stringent, like the timekeeping rules are much more stringent, right? They used to have a little bit of wiggle room about, kind of how they would report how long a trip took. And now they don't have that wiggle room. And so as a result, they drive faster, right? They drive more recklessly. They drive in conditions where they really shouldn't be driving, because like when the clock is over, it's over, right? Like they can't kind of twist it like the way they used to. So, even if we accepted that technology might be a solution to an economic problem, it clearly doesn't seem to be in this case.
I'm wondering if you heard about the story of the Rajal Aguilera Menderos. I'm sorry if I'm butchering his name. I can see from.
You might have to keep me up to speed on that. I'm not sure.
No, it's okay. It's just this is a bit of an aside. I apologize, but he was a trucker, I think in Colorado, who was sentenced to over 100 years in prison after his truck was it killed some people on I-70.
Yeah.
It ended up getting reduced to 10 years. But in reading, your book, that's what it reminded me of, which is just the idea that, I mean, he's going to bear the brunt of that as opposed to the people that he was working for. It's just another gut punch.
Yeah, no, that's, I didn't remember his name, but yes, I'm familiar with that situation. And I think that is, indicative of kind of this broader phenomenon, right? Which we see in all kinds of domains, not just in the workplace, where the risk is kind of still placed on the worker, on the person who has the least power to change things, right? And we sort of say like, well, we'll just watch you super closely and make sure you're doing all the things you need to be doing. But that, again, like doesn't change the fact that the things that they are told to do, and sometimes companies tell them to do it, right? Like many times in my research, a company would pressure a driver, would tell a driver like, you shouldn't break the rules, but also like we need this stuff to move. So you sort of put drivers between a rock and a hard place where, they're not able to make a living, and they're doing this work that we tell them is really valuable, but we don't show them is really valuable by paying them for it. And then we add this monitoring on top of that, which, I think many people are subject to more workplace monitoring than they used to be, but like truckers are really subject to it. Like it's pretty intense, the kind of scrutiny that they find themselves under. And a lot of us just wouldn't stomach it. And in trucking, actually, the folks who are the least likely to be okay with it are the safest drivers, right? Like the people who've been doing it for years or decades at a time. And, like they're used to doing it their way, right? Like they're professionals, and you tell them like, guess what? We're going to like watch your eyelids now and tell you when you're too tired to drive. Like those are exactly the people you want behind the wheel. You want to be next to that truck on the highway. And those are the folks who are leaving because they're like, why should I do this? Like, why am I doing this?
Naturally.
Right.
What are some of the ways that the companies that aggregate this information, and that's a lot of information on your employees, do they sell it? What do they use it for outside of the ascribed purpose?
Yeah, they have all kinds of things that they do. So, one thing that they do is the kind of like predictive analytics or workplace analytics that we see a lot of different companies doing. So, before there was really no way to know like who is the best trucker. Like that doesn't even really make sense. Now, like truckers it still doesn't make sense, but like now we can score truckers, like a lot of truckers get these scorecards that are issued like via this digital monitoring that give them some score. Oftentimes the companies all have different ways of doing it, but like a common thing is how much fuel they're using, because that drives costs up. So they're really concerned about that. So they get some, like employee of the month sort of thing, or they get ranked, like several companies I talk to will rank drivers and show them the rankings or give them some little gift card or something if they are the most fuel efficient or they have the best safety record or whatever it is. And that is like, again, something a lot of workplaces do, but it's just so new in trucking, right? It really changes the way that truckers think about the independence of their work. And then another thing that companies do is they'll try to make predictions. So sometimes they'll try to predict, which driver is going to leave, or like I had one guy tell me, like, oh, if the driver starts his days later, that might be a sign he's like going through a divorce or something, right? Like they try to like look for kind of big data insights, when like they could just talk to the drivers, right, and find out if they're doing okay. But then, business analytics, and then there's also kind of are data grabs by third-party companies. So insurers, of course, are interested in all this data about truckers and where they are and how they're driving. There are other companies that try to sell like parking spots, for example, right? Like truckers need to be able to reserve parking spots to sleep. And there are companies that will sort of use this data from the logging that we now have about all these drivers around the country to kind of price out parking spots and like, allow truckers to reserve those spots, things like that, right? So there's a lot of value to be derived from this data, but like very little of that value is actually seen by the workers themselves.
Right. And you also just speak about how the truckers in this case are canaries in the coal mine for larger electronic surveillance in other industries, and I'm hoping we can zoom out and talk about that as well. I think Amazon and their proposal for zapping bracelets if you're too idle made the rounds in the news. But there are keystroke trackers at office jobs. If you're typing, you got to be typing a sufficient amount of time, etc. This is happening in many different sectors. Throughout your research, what were some of the examples you found in the trends?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's, especially post-pandemic and kind of the new work landscape that involves more hybrid work, these things are just rolling out like crazy in all kinds of industries. You mentioned warehouse work, factories, like a lot of what people think of as blue collar labor have dealt with these things for a long time, but they're also rolling out across kind of more professionalized industries like medicine and law and finance and things like that. So they really are sort of coming for everyone. There was a New York Times article not long ago about productivity tracking. And one of the examples, one of the people that they talked to who was subject to this kind of gamification of their labor was like a hospice chaplain who got some number of points for like how many visits she made to dying people. I mean, it was just like a wild example.
Chaplain?
It was, yeah. It's like someone who, tends to people as they're dying.
You gotta measure the chaplain's productivity. I mean,
gotta, like how many points was that worth? So
how many God points?
So, I really think you're hard pressed to find industries or professions that aren't facing this in some way. And, I think it's definitely something to continue to be on the lookout for. It's also important to recognize that like there's a long history to this stuff. So the goals of management are not that different today than they were, 100, like in the Industrial Revolution, right? Like workers have been monitored and watched for the sake of productivity or efficiency for decades or centuries, right? But there are some things that are changing now, including, reaching out to kind of new workplaces, right? So truckers, you couldn't have done this kind of work 20 years ago because like if a trucker wanted to talk to their manager, they would go to the payphone when they felt like it and call the dispatcher, right? Like there was no knowing what they were doing most of the time. And then the types of analytics that companies will sort of run, especially predictive analytics to try to make predictions about like what their workers are likely to do. Those are fairly new developments. And another thing I think has been really interesting, actually a student told me about this, is the use of companies keeping an eye on what their workers are doing either on social media or like on LinkedIn to kind of get a sense for like, are they planning on leaving or, are they sprucing up their resume, something like that, which, I think potentially crosses a line into the kind of thing that an employer, really ought not to do. But we see more of those types of things too, services that are marketed to big companies saying like, oh, now, we'll keep an eye on your employees' LinkedIn profiles so you can get a sense for whether they're going to leave, stuff like that. So, it is a really pervasive phenomenon. And truckers are maybe kind of at the bleeding edge of some of the things we're seeing.
What do you feel that there's a role for some of these like major consulting firms in pushing these practices on these companies? Like I could see a place like McKinsey aggregating this information and spreading it throughout different sectors just because they're hired guns and they'll be like, look at how they cut costs, or look at how they monitored their
Yeah.
labor in this way.
Yeah, I think that's a smart point. I think there is always a desire to quantify and measure what people are doing. And oftentimes what we fail to kind of account for is that like some things are just hard to measure, right? So you can pretty easily measure how many emails somebody sends or like how many minutes they have a document open or whatever. Like you can figure that out. But you can't as easily track whether, you have a really meaningful conversation with your colleague or you have some great idea or whatever it is, right? Like things that are actually probably more meaningful about work are, they're just harder to measure. And that doesn't often stop us from still, kind of like wanting to spit out some number or some score for people, right? And I think you're right that that is kind of in alignment with the managerial consulting perspective on the world. But it's just a poor fit for a whole bunch of different kind of work, including trucking work and, just a whole bunch of different industries folks are in. I think you'd actually be hard pressed to find an industry where like you could easily like enumerate all of the things they do and just count them, right? Like there's a lot of kind of, soft work or wiggle room around the tasks that people do that is really important, but it's hard to track.
We have some people writing in with questions for you, so I was hoping you could respond to them.
Okay.
Prairie Fire Kowalski, our good friend Kowalski, wrote in saying, "Could you ask your guests if state laws like in Nebraska that allow farmers to drive semi-trucks without a CDL for farm use has impacted wages or safety?"
That is a good question. I don't have a lot of intimate knowledge about that law in particular. But yeah, we do see some variation across states. So the long haul industry that I've been looking at these are folks who are driving like I think it's more than 100 miles or more than 150 miles from their base routinely, right? So the folks that you're talking about are not kind of covered by some of these monitoring rules, but we do see states kind of actually adopting some of these things. So in California, for example, which is obviously a big state, we're starting to see California law talk about maybe implementing some of the same monitoring capabilities. Not really an answer to the question, but there is some kind of back and forth between the states and the feds on these.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, really fascinating discussion. I'm trying to think if I have one more question for you because I feel like I do, but it's the time of year where everything
I'm
just
with
leaves
you.
my brain.
I'm right there.
Yeah, someone wrote in also, Teamster John says, these pressures on drivers to extend the dock leading us to damage freight or worse, overload trailers. That's a good point as well. Is that something you found as well, that they're having to overload their trucks in order to make sure that they're carrying as much as possible?
I had not heard that, but that's really interesting. And and at the ports, I could definitely see that might be something that comes up. So
Gotcha.
I don't know. I'll look into that.
Well, your book is great. Really encourage people to pick it up. Late holiday gift. If you procrastinated like we all do on that front. Karen Levy, a data-driven truckers technology and the new workplace surveillance. Thanks so much for your time today, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been fun.